All right. So yeah, it turns out we've got a very good showing today to get to hear about some of Arik Kershenbaum's work, including the publishing of a book that presents his work to a popular audience about larger sorts of life, animal life, as it might exist on other planets, and whether we can make any sorts of claims whatsoever about animal life on other planets. So Arik's a zoologist connected with Girton College. So Arik, could you please take it away?
Okay, let's share some screens.
Oh, let me
allow me to share a screen. I can
yeah.
do it. No, there you go.
You should be able to share the screen now.
Right. Okay, can you see? Can everyone see? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to give a talk that's going to be a different talk. It's a different kind of talk from what this group usually hears. And I know that most of you deal with more concrete and more fundamental questions about planetary environments and atmospheres and primitive life forms and formation life and so on. But I'm going to talk about something different. I'm going to talk about what we can say, if anything, about complex life on other planets. Now, I think it's probably important right at the beginning for me to talk about what I'm not going to talk about. In other words, what this talk is not going to be about. It's not going to be about speculation. I'm very much reluctant to make speculations. Everyone wants speculations. Are aliens green? How many legs do they have? All kinds of things like this. Speculation, I don't find particularly fruitful. But it's not going to be about predictions either. And of course, in science, we're very much used to the fact that we want to make predictions and validate predictions. But we're not in a position where we can make useful predictions about complex extraterrestrial life. And we don't even really know when we would ever be able to do that. So that is a little bit of a problem from a philosophical perspective. I'm not going to give I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail about the kinds of universal laws I'm talking about, because this is meant to be a talk for non-biologists, but hopefully we'll have some time at the end to go into more detail if people want to. What I am going to talk about, though, is the fact that these universal laws of biology exist. They exist and we use them every day to understand life on Earth. The question is, to what extent can we use them to talk about life on other planets as well? And even if we can't make predictions, we can start to build up a methodology, but start to build up a philosophy of how one might investigate and make predictions about complex extraterrestrial life. And I draw the analogy, if you were out to explore an undiscovered island somewhere and you have some idea of what kind of life you're going to encounter there based on what we know about how life evolves, how life adapts to its environment. So it's building a methodology in advance of having any data. But most importantly, the aim here is to get rid of this idea, it's a very popular idea, that we cannot know anything about complex alien life. It's unknowable. It's too alien to make any kind of statements about it. It's a very common idea, and one that I don't hold with, and we'll see whether you agree with me or not. So just a little bit about me. I'm a zoologist. My field is animal communication, vocal communication mostly, and I work mostly with wolves. Which means that in the field, it's quite often a fairly Martian environment, at least temperature-wise anyway, not moisture-wise, however. But then, I also work with some deserts and tropical seas, so that kind of compensates for it. Quick shout out to my team. Well, this is my wolf team. Angela, Loretta, Amy, Jess, Beth, Hannah, and Holly. They're the ones who I do most of my work with. But a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this talk is supported by quite a diverse group of researchers. Got some zoologists, some anthropologists and also mathematicians and physicists. Lawrence Doyle in particular at the SETI Institute has been working on this idea of what we can say about alien communication, in particular from looking at animal communication on Earth. So I'm going to talk about these basic universal laws of biology which we can apply to other planets. Natural selection obviously is going to come into it a lot, and talk a bit about game theory and about kin selection. And I'm also going to go a little bit more into my specific field about communication, and to what extent what we understand about animal communication on Earth is applicable to how animals would communicate on another world. And we'll see how much detail we get into that. I want to leave some time for questions at the end. But at the beginning, the first thing that we have to understand is that natural selection is the only way of creating complexity out of simplicity. The only way except for design. And I have a whole chapter in my book about that, but I'm not going to talk about that now. Let's go with natural selection as the only way of creating complexity from simplicity. And it's absolutely crucial to understand the depth to which this applies. I mean, even the simplest forms of life are unbelievably complex. Even the most simple, primitive prebiotic structures, your little lipid cell with a bit of protein inside it, is only going to become more complex if certain structures are more able to survive than other structures and so on. So natural selection is right at the heart of the existence of life. There is no other mechanism that we know of, and there are good reasons to think there aren't any other mechanisms that can create complexity from simplicity. And natural selection has another important property, which is that it's inevitable. Any system that shows these three features, heredity, variation, and differential fitness, is likely to undergo natural selection as well. And that's important because it means that natural selection is independent of the mechanism, instantly freeing us up from one of the huge objections to speculating and building ideas about extraterrestrial life, which is that we don't know what their biochemistry is. Well, it doesn't matter that much. Whatever their biochemistry is, there will still be natural selection. They will still evolve according to natural selection. They'll still be subject to the rules of natural selection. A couple other things that are worth mentioning about natural selection is that, of course, it can only occur gradually in small steps, and they must show a concrete benefit at each stage of the evolution. And that's important because we often tend to think, particularly when science fiction authors think about aliens, they think about all these wonderful superpowers that they might have. But of course, the ancestors of those aliens must have had a concrete benefit to make a small step towards a superpower. And when we need to understand every trait can only evolve through a series of small steps with concrete benefit at each step. This is an important thing to remember when looking at any evolutionary trait at all. So if natural selection is the core of how we're going to address this, there are two other principles that I'm going to talk about a little bit. One is game theory and the other is kin selection. Game theory is going to tell us a lot about how organisms compete and cooperate. Kin selection is going to tell us a lot about how organisms organize themselves into societies. And all of these put together are manifested in a phenomenon that we call convergence, which is the very simple observation that if you have similar problems in similar situations, you're likely to get similar solutions. Now, to sort of put this visually, let's say that we understand that there is a planet with complex life on it. If it has complex life, then we can assume that natural selection must have been operating, and I'm taking this as my axiom. If natural selection has been operating, then we know that there must be heritability, variation, and differential fitness. We're not likely to know very much about how heritability works. That will depend on the biochemistry of the organisms. We're not going to know much about how variation is expressed, but we know that if there is differential fitness, then there is competition between individuals. It's the only way that natural selection can progress in. If there is competition, it will be subject to mathematical rules that we can understand through the discipline of game theory, which tells us an awful lot about how individuals will exploit each other and how they will cooperate with each other or not. Even though we don't know how extraterrestrial life might reproduce, we know that it must. It must reproduce. It must reproduce because natural selection can't operate without reproduction. And your little prebiotic capsule of lipid and protein is not going to become more complex unless it can effectively reproduce. So reproduction must be there in some way. The problem is that when we talk about reproduction, we usually talk about sex and sexual reproduction. And of course, that's something that we're not going to know about. This is a deep and complex field, which I'm not going to go into very much, but there is some reason, there are some people who would argue that if you see complexity, there must be some form of sexual reproduction. In other words, that evolution simply won't progress fast enough unless there is some sort of accelerated form of shuffling heritable information. That's not to say, of course, that evolution progresses because there is sex, only that if we were to observe a complex ecosystem, chances are that some form of sexual reproduction must have been operating. That's not a foregone conclusion, but it's something to bear in mind. Kin selection is a phenomenon that arises out of reproduction that we'll talk about in a little bit, that explains why organisms on Earth show things like altruism and cooperation. And I'll go into that a little bit and discuss whether we think that kin selection might be a common factor in life on other planets as well. So we're all fairly aware of the general property of convergence, which is that similar problems tend to give rise to similar solutions. We all know that birds have wings, bats have wings. They arose, they evolved these traits separately, independently, but they're quite similar. Wings are quite similar. Why do they both have wings? And a lot of convergence depends on simple laws of physics. Okay, there aren't that many different ways that you can fly. You can fly by being buoyant, and we see that a lot on Earth. So fish are buoyant. It's not usual to think of fish as flying, but of course they are. They're traveling through a fluid medium. There's ballistic flight, which is not particularly efficient. We do see it, but it doesn't happen a lot. But of course, the really powerful, the really interesting kind of flight is aerodynamic flight. And aerodynamic flight needs wings. So if you're going to take advantage of that, you don't have much choice but to have wings. The problem is that although we see this convergence between birds and bats, we're not quite sure how much of that is due to the specific factors of planet Earth and how much of it is really universal. There are many reasons why you may see convergence because of the specific conditions on Earth. So for one thing, it could be because we've just got a lot of fluid on Earth, but that's not really very convincing because you can't really move through anything other than a fluid. Of course, some people have speculated about organisms that travel through solids. If anyone remembers the horta from the original series, but even the horta didn't really travel through solids. They dissolved the rock with acid and then traveled through the air that was left behind. So traveling through a solid doesn't really make a great deal of sense. However, there is an objection to how universal this concept of convergence might be, and that's phylogenetic. So when you consider a bird and a bat, even though they evolved their wings independently, they are actually quite closely related. They're both vertebrates. They both have 4 limbs. So they've got their arms, and it's true that the bat has his fingers that go back to support the membrane wing, and the bird has rigid feathers. But essentially, they've got arms, and they made their arms into wings. And it could be just that the convergence that we observe is because of the phylogenetic similarity. But of course, there are many organisms on Earth that fly that are not related, and they have wings as well. So if you think about all the insect wings, they can't possibly be due to the fact that they're vertebrates, which they're not, or that they've got 4 limbs, which they haven't. The only thing really, the only phylogenetic commonality between insects and vertebrates is that they're bilaterally symmetrical. Now, I make the argument quite strongly, I think, that it's extremely likely that alien life will be bilaterally symmetrical, like well over 99% of life on Earth, of animal life on Earth. But that may or may not be the case. But it is a fairly fundamental similarity. I wouldn't call that a phylogenetic constraint because I think bilateral symmetry is going to be very widespread in the universe. So wings seem to be something that isn't just a phylogenetic coincidence. Convergence could occur for environmental reasons as well. So for instance, there's the thought experiment of why aren't there any flying whales on Earth? It's not actually all that difficult. Plenty of biochemical processes produce hydrogen. You could have an organism that has a sack of hydrogen above it and floats in the air. But the reason that there aren't any flying whales on Earth is simply that there's no food in the air. So the actual ecosystem also dictates what kinds of solutions are available to the animals. So there are reasons why convergence might be contingent on the planet Earth, but there are also reasons why it might be universal. All right, gravity works everywhere. You're going to fall. And if you live on a planet with a gaseous atmosphere, you're going to fall fast. And that's not really a good thing in general. Converting your potential energy into kinetic energy is a bit of a dead end most of the time. So there are principles that will be universal. And the other thing which Simon Conway-Morris said, which is that there aren't an infinite number of solutions to these problems. Problems like flying can't be solved in an infinite number of ways. There are actually only a few limited solutions. And if there are only a few limited solutions, then those solutions are going to get reused over and over again on different planets. So I'm going to give a bit of a introduction to some of the principles of game theory that we can also apply to other planets as well. I hope that it's not too familiar to you, but these are mathematical rules which don't seem to have any sort of contingent dependency on any of those factors that I mentioned before that could make convergence just a parochial effect of planet Earth. So the first thing that you may be familiar with is the hawk-dove game. So if you imagine a society of wonderful, peaceful doves, they're all flying around, loving each other and having a good time, and it's a kind of great place to live. And then along comes a hawk. The hawk is going to start exploiting the doves. It's going to be very successful. It's going to reproduce, and very soon all of the doves will be wiped out and taken over by hawks. And now we have a society of hawks, but a society of hawks is not a very nice place to be because they're all fighting and they're all being very aggressive. And it would have been much better to live in the society of doves. And in a society of hawks, it may be that a few doves can eke out a living because they're not spending all their time fighting and wasting energy and killing each other. So the hawk-dove game tells us a few things. It tells us that the right way to behave depends on what everyone else around you is doing. Sometimes it pays to be different, to take advantage of that little niche. And importantly, it tells you that optimality isn't always what's going to evolve. And that is demonstrated very well by the other famous experiment of game theory, which is the prisoner's dilemma. So you have two prisoners, they're being kept separately, they're being interrogated, and your problem is, should you strike a deal with the police, grass up your confederate and accept a lesser sentence? If you say nothing, you both get to go free, but you don't know what the other one's going to do. And rather than take the chance that they're going to grass you out, better to grass them out first. So the prisoner's dilemma also teaches us that what is important evolutionarily is not optimality, but stability. It's what's evolutionarily stable from a game theoretical perspective that's going to evolve. So we can see that, this principle that stability is important, not optimality, and that what you do depends on what other people are doing around you and how you're interacting with the other organisms in your ecosystem. And these are broadly applicable principles. We can sort of quantify it a bit. If you consider a population that can vary in composition from all doves on the left to all hawks on the right, and we look at the fitness of both the doves and the hawks. So in a population that's all doves, the hawks have a much higher fitness than the doves, and that declines as the population becomes more hawky. Then there exists a population composition, a ratio of doves to hawks, at which that ratio is stable. You can't do any better than that by being more hawkish or more dovish. And again, these are principles that have nothing to do with planet Earth, nothing to do with anything about how life on Earth evolved. These are principles that will be broadly applicable across the universe. And yet they are principles that dictate a huge part of animal behavior on Earth. Why animals decide to live in herds as opposed to live alone, whether you should raise your offspring together with your mate, or whether you should desert your mate and go and mate with someone else and leave them to raise your offspring. And the whole origin of animal sociality, these are all things that can't be understood without using these evolutionary stable principles of game theory. The other place where this becomes interesting is when we think about predation. So one theory, I'm sure that some of you will probably not agree with this, but we'll go with this story, is that up until about 640 million years ago, there was really very little predation on Earth. The organisms, they sort of lived fairly sedate, chill lives, just sort of floating around, getting energy from the sun, from some detritus and things like that, and not actually eating each other. And then one day, basically along came a great big predator and started to take a bite out of the other animals. And as soon as that happened, then all the organisms had to adapt. Shells, spines, digging in the ground, chasing after other animals to eat them, running away from other animals that are trying to eat you. A world without predation appears to be unstable. The moment that someone starts eating someone else, all life will have to evolve and to change for this new reality. So there are some reasons to think that alien worlds must have predation because a lack of predation is unstable. Having said that, of course, for about 85% of the history of life on Earth, there wasn't any predation. This is something that William Baines talks about quite a lot, about how likely it is that that predation must arise and how long it might take. But certainly we can expect that over a long period of time, you would expect predation to turn up one way or another. The other thing that predation does is it leads to evolutionary arms races. So if you are facing a voracious predator, it pays to have some sort of defenses against that predator. Armor, horns, maybe very fast running, some way of defeating your predator. But then, of course, the predator will evolve abilities to overcome those: bigger teeth, stronger muscles, and so on. It can't go on forever. Sooner or later, you have to reach some sort of stable equilibrium. You've got a trade-off between protecting yourself against predators and doing other things like eating and mating. And the balance can't, that unlimited spiral can't go on forever. And when that happens, some other strategies may be more appealing than having great big horns and armor. So when you look at things which are classically, iconically Earth life related, herds of wildebeest sweeping across the plains, what could be more iconic of Earth than that? But actually, that is just a totally predictable behavior that arises out of these very simple rules about the trade-offs between defending yourself using one kind of defense against predation or another kind of defense against predation, in this case, herding. And it can be shown quite easily that how and when herding is an effective defense against predators. So if predators are going to exist, herding is going to exist as well. So we shouldn't be surprised to see herds of wildebeest or equivalents on other planets. I'm going to talk a bit about kin selection, which is one of the most important aspects of evolutionary biology in terms of explaining animal behavior on Earth. Certainly it explains much social behavior on Earth, and we really do want to know about whether we expect to see social behavior on other planets, for one thing, because you probably can't have technology without social behavior. But the problem, of course, with kin selection is that it does sound very, very, very specific to Earth. It's all about sex. It's all about how related you are. Relatedness is all to do with DNA. We don't know how life on other planets might transmit information from one generation to another. So maybe there's maybe this is something that we'll find in other places. Maybe it isn't. Just for those, sort of give a quick overview of what it is. So here's me with all of my DNA. I mate and have offspring. My offspring only have half of the DNA that I had. And of course, my grandchildren only have 1/4. And so this means that I will show parental care for my offspring because they do possess some of my DNA.
Have you got right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi there.
A brilliant lecture.
Mhm.
The chap in the zoology department on sort of if there was life on other planets,
Since
how
I'm not a
different would
host,
it be?
I won't be able.
Okay. So we will see parental care because my offspring have some of my DNA. Of course, we'll also see parental conflict because they don't have all of my DNA. And so this is one of the things that drives a lot of very specific animal behaviors on this planet. The other thing, though, that we see is that siblings share genetic material. And so we will see forms of altruism between siblings. So for instance, delayed dispersal. You may have offspring who stay at the nest to help their parents raise the siblings, also because those siblings share some of their DNA. So much of the social behavior that we see in animals on Earth is due to the fact that they share DNA with each other. It explains why meerkats show territorial defense in groups. It explains the complex signaling for cooperative foraging. So bees waggle dances, why they help other bees find food. Many species give alarm calls to warn about predators. Why? Because mostly the animals that live together are in some way at least related. Social insects with much higher relatedness get involved in very complex cooperative problem solving, including a lot of self-sacrifice. And of course, if you have family groups living together, then you get cooperative rearing of young, and eventually you can get very complex societies with complex relationships and interactions between the individuals. Now, as we said, we don't really know how likely kin selection must be on other planets because we don't know what the role of sex is. But actually, it's not that complicated a question. All we need to see is that relatedness declines from generation to generation. If relatedness declines from generation to generation, we can expect to see kin selection-like behaviors. What I'm telling you now is not accepted, dogma by any means. I would say it's even quite controversial. So we could talk about this perhaps in the questions afterwards. But we understand intuitively how relatedness declines from generation to generation. Obviously, my son is related to me quite closely, less related to my parents and grandparents, and much less related to my great-parents, grandparents, and great-great-grandparents. But if we look at evolutionary history as well, we know that there is an unbroken chain between the tool-using crow of today and the organisms that lived in the Ediacaran times and before. And over the course of evolutionary history, there is a reduction in relatedness. The crow is more related to the dinosaur than it is to the prokaryotic cell. So even without knowing the exact mechanism by which heredity works, there is some reason to think that kin selection could be a broader phenomenon than just a parochial earthbound one. I'm going to talk now a little bit about my field of research. I'll probably try and go through this a little bit quickly so that we can save plenty of time for questions. I'll probably go on and on and on if you just let me do it. That's communication. So the first thing that we need to understand about communication as a universal principle is that communication always evolves from sensory modalities. Our amoeba, that is using a chemical gradient to find food, is the basis of olfaction and sense of smell. We speak because we have ears. We do not have ears so that we can speak. Our ancestors could pick up vibrations in the water to detect the food and to detect predators, and that was then the basis that evolved to speaking and using that communication modality as using that sensory modality as a communication modality. And this, of course, is why we don't see telepathy. People love to think that aliens are going to be telepathic, but the primitive ancestor of that telepathic alien must have had an advantage to detecting telepathic signals. And there's no point in detecting telepathic signals if no one is broadcasting on that channel. All right, so all of our communication modalities arose primarily as sensory modalities and were later co-opted to be communication modalities. Of course, the most familiar communication modality on Earth is the acoustic one. It has a lot of advantages on our planet. It's relatively quick. It travels far, and because of the sort of wavelength of typical sound waves, diffracts around ordinary objects, and so it's not blocked by line of sight. It's really, really useful on this planet. Animals use other modalities on Earth, surprisingly poorly studied, in fact. The visual modality for communication, so not for sensing now, I'm saying how it's been co-opted for communication. So we have lots of animals show visual displays, but of course, they have very short range. They're blocked by almost any object in their path. There's also not a simple organ or simple mechanism for decoding the frequency content of visual signals. We just have to use a small number of pigments, whereas for acoustic signals, we have a frequency analyzer, which is quite sophisticated, that can pull out detailed frequency differences. Olfaction, which, ants following an olfactory trail, is the oldest communication modality on Earth, but it's very slow, it's easily disruptive, it's not really well suited for complex communication. And then there's my favorite communication modality on Earth, which is electric field communication. It does exist. It's very rare. There's only 2 families of fish that use it in any kind of complex way. But it's very, very appealing. Electricity is probably ubiquitous as a form of life. Life needs energy. There are not that many different kinds of potential fields that you can move through to store energy in one place. Electromagnetic fields are probably the only one. It's fantastic that it has there are no frequency constraints like there are with sound. High frequency sound doesn't travel very well. You can use basically whatever you like with electromagnetic fields. But it just uses an awful lot of energy, and that's probably why it's not used very much on Earth. These are constraints of physics. These are constraints that will apply everywhere. So if there is a planet where other communication modalities cannot be used, so for instance, an underground ocean, as we know, exists in many places where there may not be any light, we can't use a visual modality. It could be that the electric field modality is more useful, and we can understand it through looking at where it does evolve on Earth and where it doesn't evolve on Earth. And where it doesn't evolve on Earth tells us almost as much, because it tells us what the constraints on that modality are and why it's not ubiquitous. The other thing that I work with is information encoding, and there's a tendency to think that the more intelligent you are, the more complex your communication must be. Actually, studies on animals on Earth have shown that's probably not the case. So if you look at animals with different information requirements, so that live in large societies or small societies, you might have thought the repertoire size in large societies is larger. It isn't. And this has led to a very important principle of information, a universal principle of information use, which is that if you want to communicate a lot of information, you will use a system that is balanced between simplicity and complexity. Not too simple, you can't say very much with a simple communication system. Not too complex, because a complex communication system is very difficult to generate and to interpret, and would require a large brain, and actually you end up with a runaway. This is a very nice paper from PNAS that talks about why you are not likely to get complex communication evolving through complex information encoding, because the evolutionary constraints are just too large. This is sometimes called Zipf's law, and actually we just had a paper come out yesterday on this, so that was kind of convenient. Zipf's law shows us that if you look at animal communication on Earth, you see that these repertoires are constrained to a fairly narrow band of information entropy at this sort of middling range between overt simplicity and too much complexity. And it does seem to be makes sense that it would be a universal constraint. So you can't say this for sure, but it would seem to be a universal constraint that the more you want to say, the more you want to restrict yourself to this narrow band that's balanced between complexity and simplicity. There are other laws of information theory. That's called the law of brevity, Menzerath's law, but I'm going to skip over those and not go into them in too much detail. I'll talk about them after if you like. Information encoding can also be done through amplitude modulation. So for instance, human speech is mostly amplitude modulated. Here you see some spectrograms. That's time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. On the left is human speech. You see there are many frequencies present, varying in different amplitudes. On the right is a wolf howl, a single frequency, varying in pitch. And whether or not you use amplitude modulation or frequency modulation depends very much on the environment in which you're living. It depends particularly on the nature of the propagation, how far you want to propagate your sound, which depends also on the medium and on the the density and ambient noise and so on. So these again are physical constraints that are determining whether an organism is going to speak like a human or speak like a wolf. But these are universal constraints of how information can be put into signals. I'm going to rush through the rest of it. I think this is more stuff that we've done. You can consider whether information is going to be contained in a sequence of discrete signals, like the bird song on the top spectrogram, or in a continuously varying signal like the dolphin whistle at the bottom. And again, the answer to that question, which are we going to use, a sequence of discrete signals or a continuously varying signal, depends very much on the propagation properties of the environment, how error prone it is. Am I going to need to repeat myself? Well, I know if the receiver has received a message and I need to repeat myself. And in those more lossy environments, the continuous signals do seem to have an advantage. Again, these are common solutions to common problems, and no reason to think that that same thing is not going to apply on other worlds. Finally, we sort of tried to synthesize all of this together and to get to the bottom of how the different possible ways that animals can communicate. Actually, this paper, which is from quite 6 years ago, was before I started getting interested in extraterrestrial life, but it was where I first met Lawrence Doyle, who's one of the key people. Sort of introduced me to the whole SETI side of things. And the idea was, let's get down and find the most fundamental ways in which animals can communicate. Let's try and break it down to the most the universal divisions of types of communication. And of course, once you do that, then you can assess whether such communication methodologies make sense on other planets or not. But as I said, I don't want to spend too much time talking about my animal research. Probably not that interesting to most of you. So in conclusion, I'm not making predictions. I don't want to make predictions. I want to develop a methodology that is based on the idea that there are universal principles that apply to the evolution of life on Earth. There are contingent principles as well, of course, but there are also many, many, many universal principles that are simply going to exist everywhere in the universe. Natural selection is going to exist. Game theory is inescapable. Kin selection probably exists, certainly at least some places. And in my book, I go into all these things in much more detail. It is a popular book, but there's still some stuff in there that I think that scientists are going to be interested in. And most importantly, we shouldn't be afraid of considering what complex alien life is going to be like. As I say, shouldn't be afraid. I had to put that in just to make clear. I don't mean we shouldn't be afraid of them coming and eating us. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of investigating these possibilities. It's not idle speculation. It's simply the application of the rules that we have uncovered through investigating life on Earth and applying them to life on other planets. So I wanted to rush through that last bit a little bit so we have some time for questions. So yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk. And I'm about halfway through Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy, and I can definitely say that it is a worthwhile read and is understandable to at least this non-zoologist. So, so we definitely have some time for questions. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first one and go a little bit back to what we do typically talk about, which involves sort of prebiotic chemistry, but this will be a bit more maybe of a philosophical question. And it came up because of one of the very first things that you said, that the only two ways to go from simplicity to complexity are design and natural selection. But from what I've seen from prebiotic chemical systems, all the ones that we've been able to achieve so far are incapable of natural selection. And you need a certain threshold of complexity, which is more complex than what you typically start with to get to natural selection. So do you think that this indicates that design is required for the origins of life? Or do you think that there's some unknown mechanism? Or do you think that sometimes chemical mechanisms can rarely kind of make that particular jump? Which of those three, or is there a fourth option that you think explains?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with the third one, but I think that there's no doubt that this is a big philosophical question. I think that that life would be a lot more common, obviously, if as you say, these prebiotic systems were capable of evolving through natural selection. The design element, and I want to make it perfectly, you probably haven't got to that chapter yet. The design element, I'm not talking about intelligent design from above. I'm talking about what would happen if we, for instance, as a technological civilization, could design organisms and leave them to themselves, leave them to exist by themselves on a planet, and what would happen then. There are plenty of people who are involved in the sort of discussions of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence who say life in the universe is going to be overwhelmingly artificial. Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, there are reasons to think that might not be the case, but certainly you could design a proto cell. You could design an early life form and then just let it go and see what happened. And we can't exclude that possibility. The reason it's not an answer to the question, of course, is because the designer had to evolve first. No, I think, but I think that yeah, it's just got to be the unlikely coincidences. But again, I'm not gonna rule on that one because you guys are the experts.
Yeah, and by design, I was open to both of those possibilities. probably one of them is a little bit more testable. If an alien civilization did in fact start life here, we might be able to find some sort of evidence of that at some point in time, right?
That's essentially the question
Okay.
that I've got in this one of the last chapters of my book, and the real issue here is so life on Earth has evolved through Darwinian selection. We know that, we observe that. It doesn't appear to have evolved through any Lamarckian mechanism. In other words, we don't inherit our useful experiences. And that's a little odd, because you might have thought that if someone had designed, if you're going to design life, you may as well design it not just to learn from its mistakes, but also to pass them on to its children. So that could be an argument for saying that's, you know, that we're not designed because I wouldn't have designed it that way. But there are counter arguments as well.
Great. Thanks. All right. Well, it's open for questions from anyone who's here. Please feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up or raise your hand.
Okay, well, I'll jump in.
Great.
This business of there being no predation for the first 85% of
I knew you were going to
life on Earth, you know that's not true. And there's predation right from day one. And so I think what you're getting at is that there's a different kind of predation comes along with animal predation, and it gives rise to a flurry of evolutionary innovation. And what that is, as much as anything, it's a new technology that comes along, I think, which is this business of having a multicellular predator, and that gives rise to a new set of rules. So here, let me just say one other thing, which is that one of the ways that animals communicate, a lot of animals communicate with each other is with mobile phones. And in some sense, and you never talked about mobile phones, but that's just a bit of technological innovation as well, and it's it's giving rise to a whole new range of adaptations and possibilities and so on. But so as much as anything, this business depends on the discovery of new technologies, is what I'm getting at, of the eukaryotic cell, of animals, of the internal combustion engine, of mobile phones.
Yeah, and okay, you're absolutely right about predation, and I mean I could go on for ages and ages, but it's a very important point that right from the outset, from the beginning of life, the moment you have energy in the form of organisms, you're going to have other organisms that are going to get their energy from that. Right? This is down to the game theoretical considerations. Life must have energy. Life is all about maintaining disequilibrium with the environment. You can only do that with energy. You need that energy. So you will have predation, as you put it, predation as it is, right from the beginning. Absolutely, 100%. And the whole Cambrian explosion thing is a particular kind of predation. 100% agree. When it comes to mobile phones, so this is really where we come back to Paul's point about design, which is that we've designed mobile phones. And it's only because we have the ability to do that, because we have the foresight, that we can do that. The example that I usually give for this is supersonic flight. All right? Why are there no supersonic animals? Because as you approach the speed of sound, flight becomes very inefficient. You're losing a lot of energy in shock waves that are generated as you approach the sound barrier. And so any animal would cease to become faster. If there was an advantage to being faster and faster, you would reach the point where it was simply not efficient to become faster and faster and faster, because the faster you go, the more wasteful your travel is. The only reason we travel faster than the speed of sound is because an engineer sat down and thought, if only we could get past the sound barrier, flight would be much more efficient. But there's no if only in evolution.
Well, look, but it's just the extended phenotype, though. But it's all part of the process.
Yes, and that's what has happened. Once you reach a certain level of complexity, then you have the ability, either through an extended phenotype, a society, a university, and so on, to make those decisions, or you have, you need the
I'm just wondering what the difference is. I mean, it's a similar kind of technological innovation when you get the eukaryotic cell, when you get animals, and the internal combustion engine. These are all technological things that are built on previous innovations, and they open up new avenues for exploration.
Yeah. So you're saying that technology is inevitable as well?
Well, I don't know. I'm wondering if you say that, or I might. If I was you, I might say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do. I mean, I do think that is the case. I think that once, and in particular, if we accept that sociality is inevitable, that sociality will also evolve on other planets, because there are other factors that are driving the advantage of living in societies, and there are protection against predation, better foraging, and so on. Then you would expect the associated increase in cognitive complexity, and leading in the end to language and the ability to plan and to cooperate to build mobile phones. Yeah.
Sure. No. Thank you.
It was a great discussion. It looks like Martin has a question. Please go right ahead.
Hi, hello. I missed the first 15 minutes, so maybe you answered this. Could there be planets with very complicated plant life, but no animals? I mean, is there anything which would somehow imply that you couldn't really have a sort of biosphere without animals, or should we be perhaps looking for very elaborate plant life with no animals?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. It's a question that I struggle with a lot. I struggle a lot with in my book as well, and I think Nick will probably have a lot to say about this as well. But I think there is a fundamental difference between animal and plant life, and that is that animals move. Okay, if we've got to take the broadest definition of animal, what an animal might be on another planet, it's going to be something that moves. And that introduces the element of urgency. So plants don't have urgency. And if you have an ecosystem which is based entirely on sessile organisms, not moving, no urgency, then there are a lot of these forces, evolutionary forces, which have led to things like sociality, technology, communication, language, which are going to be much less prominent, much less developed. So there are some things in the universe that are limited. Space is limited, energy is limited, and time is also limited. Okay, so this idea that I don't have all the time in the world to decide whether to run away from a predator or not drives a lot of evolutionary innovation. And I think that if you have an ecosystem only consisting of plants, then a lot of that's going to be missing. That's a sort of brief answer. Yeah.
But in the very long run, the plants could take over.
So in that case, though, I mean, I would expect then that there to be a niche for a herbivore, for someone who can exploit the plants by virtue of the fact that they're slow and the herbivore is fast. So I think we'll always have someone eating the plants if the world is just plants.
Well, a huge amount of plant diversity is a consequence of animal diversity, of course. And it's also worth knowing that plants appeared on this planet considerably later than animals did, which is strange insofar as they seem a little bit less complicated. But animals came first, and then there's a couple 100 million years, and then the land turned green, and only very, very recently do you get angiosperms. Most angiosperms are pollinated; they're fertilized by animal vectors in one way or another. I don't think we would have anywhere near the kind of plant diversity unless we had a pretty rich animal diversity co-evolving with them.
Yeah,
just very, very quickly, and I hate to interrupt this discussion. We have reached the the 3 o'clock mark. I've made Arik the host, so please continue the discussion as long as you like. Unfortunately, I'm going to need to run to another meeting, but please also join me in thanking Arik again for a wonderful talk and a wonderful discussion. So, great.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon.